Who knows what evil lurks in the heart of games? The shadows know. Okay, now finally the conclusion. Which one of those systems should you buy? And I would say if you can get any of those 5 systems for cheap, let's say €50, dollar, pound, for a complete system with the necessary accessories, where you need at least a data set for the Commodore 64. A floppy disk drive with a couple of disks would be much better. Yeah, with the Amstrad you basically have to have the monitor, or you have to get an extra power supply and an RGB cable to connect it to a SCART television or an RGB monitor. But I found using tapes on the Amstrad really quite reliable and doable. Same with the Spectrum. For the Spectrum you need something like... Is it off? Yes, it is off. You need something like this. A Kempston joystick interface. So you can use a joystick with the 48K Spectrum. For the plus 2 models you need a special Sinclair joystick or an adapter. And basically, yeah, an adapter cassette for the plus 2 or a simple tape cable. I think mono to mono or stereo to stereo or something like that. To connect the Spectrum to an MP3 player or to your PC sound card. So yeah, they are quite easy concerning data transfer. MSX is not that hard as it looks if once you figure it out, and you have, if you don't have an hit bit with the integrated software, you can transfer ROMs, cartridge images. But the tape games are quite... I didn't see too many tape games, and they are not that good for the MSX. Tape games for the other systems, Spectrum and the Amstrad, and also original tape games for the Commodore 64 are quite cheap. Especially if you find them in a lot. Don't pay much more than £1 or £2 euros for a normal tape game, especially not for those that are really common. Yeah, Commodore 64, using tapes with Commodore 64 is not that great. Especially not if you use a cassette recorder to record the tapes. And it's even a pain if you write them on the same system with the same dataset you're going to read them. So I really recommend Zoom floppy for the Commodore 64 and a real disk drive, or one of those floppy emulators, SD to IEC, or if you have the money, get a 1541 Ultimate. I think it's the Ultimate 2 by now. Yeah, for the disk-based Amstrads you can get an floppy emulator, the HXC 2001 that I have in my Amiga down there. For the Spectrum there's a device that I'm not quite sure what it does. I think it loads from either an SD card or a compact flash card or something like that. But I have found using tapes with the Spectrum not that horrible, same with the Amstrad. So yeah, it will take a while until I eventually buy a floppy emulator for the Amstrad or a Divide for the or Div IDE for the Spectrum. And since I do have working floppy drives and blank disks, there's also no pressure for me to get a floppy emulator for the Commodore 64. Atari was a different beast. I really went through a lot of pain when I used the cassette, or used the method. I described in my other video. So as soon as I could afford it, I bought this floppy emulator. It works reasonably well. It would work better if I would understand how this selector programs would work. And yeah, it's still confusing what the buttons do on boot up, with the boot up screen. But don't bother with tapes on the Atari. Either get a disk drive, or if you don't want to bother with real floppy disks, get this SD to SIO floppy emulator. There are other devices that I think also can emulate ROM cartridges, but I don't think I have found a game on ROM where I didn't find a cracked version on floppy disk or as a single executable file. So yeah, I think that's the cheapest way and best value for your money if you want to use the Atari and don't want to use original cartridges or tapes or discs. Yeah, so which one should you buy? As I said again, if you get one cheap, get it. $50 for a working system with some extras. Joystick is always nice, a working one. You might know that is my favorite, but there are other good working joysticks. Yeah. So if you want the machine with the best games and the machine with the most games, get a Commodore 64. It's the most widely spread. You will have to spend a little more if you really don't want to use the tape transfer method too much. If you really want to write back tape images, there are other more complicated or more expensive solutions for that. You can use the 1541 Ultimate as a tape emulator, as far as I know. And yeah, you can use the X1541 cable. It's connected to a DOS PC. That must not be faster than I think 500 or 600 megahertz. It must not be too fast. Pentium class machine is fine. Yeah, and you connect the Commodore 64 with the DOS machine and can record to a dataset connected to the Commodore 64. It works really well. I've converted a couple of tapes to tab images with that, and all of them worked. If they loaded correctly on the Commodore 64. Also quite handy for transferring collections of turbo tapes. So yeah, there are programs that extract the single file from the turbo tape. But you really don't want to bother with tapes, so either get a disk drive and a zoom floppy, or get the SD to IEC emulator. It's not that expensive, you can build it yourself if you want. And yeah, but you have to program an Atmel microcontroller. But it's much more comfortable than using tape. So yeah, get a Commodore 64, or get one of those systems you had as a kid. That's the other approach. You will get great games for all 5 systems. It's just the Commodore 64 had the best games and the most games. Surprisingly, the technically weakest system, the Spectrum, has the second most games. That's not a surprise because it was cheap and very popular in the UK and other countries. Not so popular here in Germany, but the games are really fun to play. A lot of games are really fun to play. They are fast, they are responsive. If you can live with the monochromic graphics or the bad color clash in other games, and you can live with the kind of weak sound, get a Spectrum. You will have a lot of fun with it. Maybe as a second system besides the Commodore. Those two systems, the Commodore 64 and the Spectrum, are generally the most universal system. You will get more serious games, more role-playing games and such stuff like the Bard's Tale and Fantasy and Ultima and stuff on the Commodore 64, just because it was not unusual outside the UK to use the Commodore 64 with a disk drive. Never really seen a Spectrum with a disk drive or used with a disk drive. And I don't think there are any official disk drives or DOSes before the Plus 3, and that only had this weird Amstrad 3-inch disk format. So yeah, the Spectrum is surely a tape-based system, while the Commodore 64 is pretty much a disk-based system. You can use it with tapes, but it's much more comfortable and less annoying with a disk drive. The Atari has one big disadvantage besides the crappy tape loading, and I think that was one of the reasons the Atari didn't catch on in the UK, because the UK was really a tape-based market. Yeah, the other bad thing about the Atari is that it pretty much got abandoned in 1984-85, and there are very few games released after that. And most of the ports, I mean games that were released on several systems, the Atari version is quite weak for games after 1984-85. So yeah, it has great early games, but not so many great later games. Technically it's a little bit weaker than the Commodore 64, but not too much. It's a gaming. It's a computer designed as a gaming system, unlike the Sinclair, which was a computer designed to be cheap, and the Amstrad, which was designed to be a home computer. And yeah, that's the weak point of the Amstrad. I think you have seen it in the second part of this series. Amstrad games are often quite slow, or like an Arkanoid, that was not the first time they vary in speed, and in a game like Arkanoid, where you have to be precise and timing matters, that's an absolute no-go. That it really ruins the game. Again, there are great games on the Amstrad. They all look great on screenshots, on still photos, but yeah, sadly the CPU is not powerful enough to do everything in software. And with no hardware sprites, no hardware scrolling, it's just too weak for most type of games. Anyways, if you get one cheap, buy it. You will have a lot of fun with it. It still has a lot of good games, but it rarely has the best version. And yeah, on the other hand, it will give you very few. I had very few trouble with the Amstrad machine loading from tape. If it really doesn't work, check out the tape image in an emulator. I very often had that it didn't load in the emulator, and if it does load in the emulator and you're recording it to a real cassette, try slowing down or speeding up the file before you record it to cassette by 10, 15, 20, 25%. You have to find the correct value, because your tape deck might not run at exactly the same speed as your recorder in the Amstrad. And that's again a general tip. If you record to real cassette, try speeding up or slowing down the file slightly. Also try to adjust the tracking of the tape recorder you load it with. There's a little screw above the tape button. You should know how it works. I'm pretty sure there are tutorials on the internet how to do that. Just play back. If it doesn't load, turn the screw while playing a quarter turn to the left. If it doesn't work, turn it a quarter turn to the right, or yeah, then you have to turn a half turn to the right. And basically that might help. Tape loading is always tricky until you find the correct positions. And yeah, Amstrad is, in my opinion, the weakest gaming system. It does have a lot of games, but it only has a few original games, mostly ports from other systems. and since it was not very hard to port from the Spectrum to the Amstrad, there are many lazy Spectrum ports, and they generally look worse and run slower on the Amstrad. So yeah, not a bad machine, great home computer. It has very sophisticated basic compared, especially to the Commodore 64. But not my favorite gaming system. And finally the MSX, yeah, also very mixed feelings with that. I'm quite limited with my MSX machine because yeah, ROM cartridges won't load from tape, so I have to get the original cartridge, which I did for Nemesis, just because I wanted a cartridge to test the machine before I could figure out how tape loading and all this stuff worked, and I knew it was a good game, so no money wasted on that. Yeah, but the Japanese games for the MSX are very often quite good, especially considering yeah, the very limited hardware capabilities, and MSX fans will hate me for that, but the lack of support for smooth scrolling, and yeah, you see smoother scrolling on the Amstrad and the Spectrum and on the Atari ST than on the MSX, so it's really jerky scrolling. And the sprite movement is very smooth because it has hardware sprites with some limitations. They are monochrome, only 4 in a single line, but on the other hand 32 of them. Yeah, so the sprite movement is very smooth. Sound is same level as the Amstrad. Not the greatest, but yeah, not really terrible. For sound effects it's very okay, but I prefer the music from the SID chip. It's yeah, that's the difference between the SID chip and the sound chips in the Amstrad, the Atari, the MSX, and in the later Spectrum models. The SID chip is basically a very simple synthesizer chip, and the others are basically just programmable sound generators. They generate waveforms and square waves and noise, and yeah, SID chip is much more sophisticated in that aspect, but it does not produce the most beefy sound effect. Yeah, all systems are, if you live in the right country, reasonably cheap. So yeah, get a Commodore 64 and get all the other systems if you can get them. But if you're new to retro games and want a system to basically play the typical games on and don't get disappointed, get a Commodore 64. It's really the best gaming system of this era. Not that the others are bad, but Commodore 64 is the best. And it was also the best back in the days. I was lucky I got one. Basically I wanted one because all my classmates had one, and I already figured out how to copy games before I got my Commodore 64. And I think back in the days this was the easiest system to copy cracked games. Because yeah, in theory you could load it from tape with a load command and save it to tape with a save command. Didn't take me long to figure that out. Didn't work with later games, but with the smaller games from 84, 85 it did work. Or at least with many of them. And with turbo tape it's not very hard to figure out that you have to load turbo tape and then use arrow L and arrow S instead. I know there are simple copying programs for the Atari, even for the tape, which load each single data block and write it back to another tape. If you want to wait half an hour to copy a single tape. Yeah, but nobody I knew had an Atari back in the days. I think I've seen an Amstrad machine once in the real life. Not in a shop, but at one of my classmates. If I remember correctly, I one of my classmates had one of those TI machines, but I guess after 5th or 6th class he moved and didn't know what happened to him. But I have seen one of those TI machines in real life. Only seen a Spectrum and an MSX in catalogs or in the shops. And I don't know how to copy, how it was to copy games on the MSX. Tape games, I think, MSX, Spectrum, all of the machines, you could try to copy them on a double tape deck. But I tried this once on the Commodore 64 and it did load, but usually I had to try with an original tape 2 or 3 times, and with the copy I had to try 10 times. So yeah, didn't work too well. Yeah, clear winner. Commodore 64, overall the best machine, most powerful machine for games. And all this is as a gaming machine, if you want to use it as a home computer, and I don't know why you really should or would use one of those machines as a home computer, because if you want to program BASIC, you can also do it in an emulator. If you want to control something, use an Arduino or a Raspberry Pi and don't destroy your, potentially destroy your old Commodore 64. Yeah. And if I make a ranking, first place surely the Commodore 64, second place the Spectrum, and basically all the other machines on third place, because yeah, you get good games for all 5 machines. That's the conclusion of this. You get more and better games for the Commodore 64 and the Spectrum, and to less extent you get a little bit more games for the Amstrad, but the MSX games, not the European ones, they are horrible. Yeah, but they all are basically the same. Let them share this the third place. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this series, and yeah, I hope you can look forward to. I think I'm going to play some MSX games. I try to find some better ones. You've seen in the third part how much work it is to make a game load from cassette where I don't have a cassette image from, and most Japanese, the better ones, don't have a cassette image, so won't be too many. And yeah, now I have one machine more in my Let's Compare videos. That does mean it's even more work to make a Let's Compare videos, but I also feel better with them because they're more complete. So I'm pretty much not sure at which rate I will release more videos. Definitely keep the Let's Compare videos, and I think for the next couple of weeks I'll throw in the odd MSX video. So yeah, thanks for watching.